Chapter 10. Ground and Sky. It happened 3 days after the oracle left, at the hour when stone is warm from noon, but shadows begin to mean it. In the inner court, where water always found its drains, a quarrel learned to call itself a battle. Raina and Marius, who knew every inch of one another's temper, the way siblings know the map of a shared room, had been arguing with the fierce economy of 5-year-olds about whose friend Rife was more today. "She promised to hold me when I get too stormy," Marius said, chin up. "She promised to fly with me when I get wings," Raina said, chin just as high. They stepped toward one another like weather systems that had never been properly introduced. Raina's mouth rounded with a word that had not learned consonants yet, but knew fire. A lick of heat snapped free. Marius's weather, always too ready to please, answered with a quick, sharp line of lightning that did not ask permission. Rife went between without thinking, the way some people are born to. Flame met her from one side, white thread of thunder from the other, and the courtyard held its breath for the appalling sound of burning or worse. There was no cry, there was, if anything, a sigh, as if someone had poured a bowl of water onto a hot stone. Lightning sank into her as water into sand. Heat arrived as a cool breeze. The little girl blinked, whole and unmarked, and then burst into tears from outrage rather than pain. "Stop it!" she begged them, hiccuping, wiping her face with the practical violence of a child. "I am a friend to you both. Stop." Alaris, who had come to the doorway at the sharp shape of their noise, crossed the court in 3 strides and did not shout. He caught both hot, indignant hands in his and knelt to make his eyes level with eyes that had learned too fast that they could be weapons. "Enough," he said in the tone men keep for horses and men who want to be better. "We train. From tomorrow." Later, Katarin made the investigation into courtesy rather than interrogation. He asked Rif to hold a copper coin. The copper cooled in her palm the way metal does when it remembers its ore. He asked her to stand inside a ring, laid very carefully with threads woven out of weather and old words. The ring went slack, as if it had been cut, and could not remember where its ends belonged. He brought his hand close to her hair and summoned the smallest, meanest spark he knew how to make. The spark chose not to exist, rather than be rude to her. "A sink of magic," Katarin said finally, not with distaste but with the satisfaction of a word finding its chair. Not absence. Opposition. A grounding rod in a world that likes to climb. Unique. He glanced at Solara, who lifted her hands, honest to a fault. "Not from mine," Solara said, a little fierce to protect what she could. "We have many faults in my vast family. This is not one." "Well, if that man ever comes calling, we can ask him. Until then, it is just hers," Annlena said, practical and kind at once. "We will be grateful and careful. Both are due." The next morning, the nest rearranged its hours to fit discipline around play and not choke either. Alaris began with rules older than kingdoms and as useful. How to stand, how not to run when running is what the blood wants. How to breathe through temper and let it go by like bad weather. Wooden swords appeared because most lessons are easier when you can hold them in your hands. Rif took to them with a calm appetite that made Alaris's brow go doubtful, and then, before the week was out, convinced. Afternoons belong to control. Katarin taught Marius the mathematics of weather, counts, pauses, the dignity of stopping a thing as deliberately as you started it. Rif sat between them, ready to be grasped when Marius felt the sky sweeping him away. "Boots off," Annlena would say when his power tried to run indoors, and he learned to oblige. Then she taught him ledgers of power and resource, for someday he might need to hold a kingdom. Elisa taught Raina the first vocabulary for heat. Bank, bank more, no, yes, now, not now. Rif sat between them, and when a lesson went crooked, she put her palm to a forearm or a knee, and the room remembered to exhale. "Ground," Elisa would say, approving. and Riff would smile into her own lap as if to keep the satisfaction from startling anyone. When the sky cleared for it and courage had slept, Rainer's body remembered how to be large. The first days of flight were the way all first days are. Glorious, clumsy, exactly right. Elisa took to the air with the ceremonial boredom of a veteran pretending not to be pleased. Alaris on her back felt the old joy subset into a new duty of teaching a youngling with safety in mind. Rife, light as a thought and twice as steady, rode Raina without presumption, learning the trick of lending balance without taking will. They worked in twos, Alaris and Eliza circling wide to watch, Rife and Raina making the short, honest hops that build into flight in partnership. When Raina flared too eagerly, Rafa's hand and voice made her breathe. When Rife leaned too far into care, Raina's exuberance shook her shoulder lightly until she laughed instead of concentrating. The girls made a good team because together they were one whole courage. Marius refused to be sidelined and took the high wall as his practice ground, learning to call a breeze that pushed Raina's wingtip up at exactly the moment she would otherwise clip stone. He and Raina continued to quarrel like tide and moon like siblings tend to do. Sleet did her duty as first mount for the children, along with leaving behind a few foals to take over the duty of carrying the young. The foals were unintended, for Alaris had wished to offer Sleet simply a retirement, but nature found its way anyway a few times. One quiet summer night when children were 10 and away in the North Sleet quietly passed in her paddock. Alaris and Annalena buried her at the start of the slope where the road to the nest got difficult and commissioned a stone statue of her to stand there, offering encouragement to any horse at the start of the climb. The statue was deliberately made easy to scale for amusement for any child willing to dream of riding a great war horse. Sometimes Alaris found himself astride the statue, talking to an old friend long gone when sleep would not come. When the children visited Lady Liana in the north for summers, neighbours learned at once to like the children, and then, for safety's sake, to decide privately that the two always at each other's throats were twins, and the quiet one with southern skin always steadying them, their adopted sister. The household did not trouble to correct anyone, and they spent many lively summers at Redder House, rediscovering the playgrounds of their parents. Lord Redder watched with that old, patient interest that had rebuilt a stable roof with a boy and then rebuilt the boy with the same hands for the children's aptitudes and skills. He had mild doubts about teaching the arts of war to a girl whose first gift was to unmake harm despite Alaris's urging, until the evening she tackled Marius around the knees when a gust began to go from helpful to proud and banged him down laughing. 2 days later, she caught Raina by the back of her dress in the dining hall when Delight tried to throw the surprise of a dragon in the middle of soup and returned her to the chair with the dignity of a cat who had decided not to fall off a shelf. "For the good of the world," Redder said afterwards, almost smiling, and put her on a spirited young horse with a practice lance in her hands when Marius was taught to read ledgers and balance accounts. Raina had flown off to be large on her own terms, and Redder had found her idly swinging a stick in the yard. Riff learned quickly because the body likes being told what it is good at. She learned to fall and get up in the same motion, to read distance as if it were written on paper, to see not just where a blow was, but where it intended to be, and not stand there first. Both men taught her the code of a knight. Honour, duty, oaths worthy of a knight, and she took to those two with the same natural aptitude and stubbornness she did to holding a lance. Chapter 11. Weather Just for Us. High summer at Lady Liana's northern house had its own arithmetic. Heat held politely to the afternoons, mornings crisp enough to make breath visible for 3 blinks, evenings that smelled of cut hay and riverstone still drying. The house let the children inhabit it like weather, predictable in pattern, mischievous in detail. They were 12 that particular summer and believed, with the calm certainty of creatures not yet contradicted by distance, that the map of the world, hinged on their small arguments. Raina and Marius quarrelled daily with an efficiency that spared everyone long speeches. They did it the way twin weather systems meet over a valley. Brief clash, redistribution, useful rain left behind. In the orchard rows they raced. Raina, on light feet, forbidden from being large on pain of no dessert. Marius calling a tailwind he insisted was study. Rife sat halfway up a ladder picking fruit with the meditative efficiency of someone who had discovered stillness could be chosen. When Raina cut a corner too sharply and slid in grass, Marius crowed until she bounced up laughing and declared the race invalid because wind interference constitutes fraud. The ledger of victories remained a smudge of contested entries. At the river shallows, where stones lay like old coins and trout wrote shimmering punctuation, rivalry shifted medium. Raina skipped stones with insulting grace, making 5, then 6 bounces. Marius shaped a breeze that lifted her fourth throw just enough to die early. She turned on him narrow-eyed. He assumed an expression of angelic scholarship. Rife, knee-deep, lifted a single brow, and the guilty breeze flattened itself into regular currents while both loudly pretended nothing had happened. They divided chores at the stables by competing for the least desirable portions of tackroom cleaning. Rife resolved it by calling all tasks better done by 2 pairs of hands and wandering off to groom the horses. They grumbled side by side in the cool tackroom until Marius admitted Raina's method for scrubbing brass worked better than his. Raina pretended she had not heard his quiet admission. Peace returned, thin but serviceable. Rivalry had rules. You did not enlist Rife as a weapon, only as referee. You did not wake adults with trivial appeals. You did not scorch or spark. You did not aim to wound, only to win. Violations carried penalties payable in apologies, chores or surrendered dessert. One afternoon, a visiting neighbour's grandson, sent with a basket of early berries and the sort of self-satisfaction boys of noble upbringing acquire when no one yet has knocked it out of them, found them testing a new game behind the stable. Raina was piling sacks of feed on one end of a seesaw made of a plank and a barrel while Marius was sitting on the other, trying to guess how many would it take to lift him off the ground. Insults were flying freely in the air. "You let a slip of a girl do the heavy lifting while you sit there pretty as a princess," the boy asked Marius cheerfully, meaning to provoke the smaller boy to recklessness and insult the girl in passing. Riff, who had been sanding a practice lance shaft and minded nobody's business as long as nobody minded hers, looked up without moving otherwise. She did not need to speak. Both playing on the makeshift scale went very still in the way stone goes still before weather decides whether to be kind. Raina lowered the sack she had been holding with a precision that made a point and stepped once toward the boy. Marius also moved, letting the now empty end of the plank snap up and sacks land with a thud. He did not stand behind her, not ahead, alongside, the deliberate alignment of a flank that has never required rehearsal. "What did you say?" Marius asked, voice even in the way that Lord Redder spoke when he expected them to pay attention in lessons. The boy, unaware he had crossed a line that had never been drawn for him, laughed. Raina's hand flicked out, plucked one of the boy's berries and held it up. Then she crushed it with a pointed glee. "Looks," she said mildly, looking at her crimson fingers and not the boy, "can be deceiving. Marius here at least has enough brains to not sprout nonsense to people he is not familiar with." She stuck the crimson fingers in her mouth. Marius added, just as mild, "And she can crush you just as easily as that berry. Mind your manners." A faint curl of breeze lifted the boy's hair and placed it back down. Riff laid her sanding block aside and spoke for the first time. "Apologize," she said, not loudly. The boy flushed with the sudden comprehension that he was outnumbered not only in bodies but in united intention. He managed a stiff, stammered apology to them both and to Riff out of an instinct for thoroughness, then fled. The moment he cleared the gate to the house, they resumed rivalry as if someone had unpaused a game. Raina called Marius pretty princess while inviting him to resume his seat on the plank, and found herself tripping over his foot a moment later. Riff resumed sanding, mouth slanting toward amusement she would deny. Lady Lyanna, who had seen the confrontation from the herb garden where she was overseeing an apprentice gardener's basil crisis, said nothing then. At supper, she set an extra dish of berries on the table without comment. Rhaina blinked at the familiar colour, deep summer crimson, and remembered the taste. She let her dragon greed run free, declaring Marius deserving only a minority share, for she was the biggest, and Marius protested loudly. Rife confiscated the disputed dish with a sigh and redistributed the content equally, not forgetting the elders. She reminded them that they owed thanks to the boy who brought them, and both nodded. In bed that night, Rhaina lay human, staring at the ceiling's slow, summer shadow geometry, thinking without confessing that it had felt good. Marius's shoulder exactly there, his wind ready, her heat ready. Rife, a silent perimeter. Marius in the next room annotated the day's ledger of weights and added one uncharacteristic note in the margin. Outsider. Insufficient courtesy. Correction administered. In the morning they were at it again, bickering in full voice, while Rife, already tying on her practice greaves, shook her head fondly. The valley accepted their noise. Above them the sky waited for the day when colour and mastery would arrive, perfectly content for now with weather that knew how to close ranks when required. The northern house kept the incident without gossip, and 3 of them were seen in a few days at neighbour's house with a basket of good cheese, words of thanks, and an invitation for the grandson, who was called Auntie by his grandmother, to come play at the river with them. He went, but never forgot the lesson. By the end of that summer, he too was permitted to join in the mockery, but only with an apology held at the ready in case it landed amiss. Auntie learned, of course, during that summer who his company really was. A mage prince, a young dragon, and a girl who insisted she was common as muck, daughter of the other 2's wet nurse, who could nonetheless get in between dragonfire and mage thunder and walk away unharmed. Marius was his cousin, and he too could be called a prince, for his father was Princess Anlena's brother. But nobody did, and almost a dozen people would need to meet an unfortunate end for somebody to try to drop the northern crown on him. A state of affairs he preferred, for to be a king was about as welcome to him as a surprise wasp's nest in one's favourite hideout. One day, Auntie, who was also intending to become a knight, challenged Riff to spar full of the arrogant confidence of a young man never expecting to lose to a girl. Riff made him yield so easily that she suspected he was losing on purpose and held no mercy for him, until he tapped out with tears in his eyes. He did not learn from one go, he insisted she was lucky and tried again, but swore eventually to never spar with Riff again. He offered in jest to marry her when she grew up, for he was already properly put in his place, and that would save her the hassle. When Marius protested, Rhaina could not hold back and retorted that boys who had an Eastern princess destined to them should not be greedy, and Riff can absolutely wed Auntie if she wants to. Marius did not agree, and an argument ensued. Both Riff and Auntie wisely took a step back and left them to their bickering. The summer went on, loud where permitted, quiet where necessary. Rivalry and friendship remained a daily exercise in growing up. Auntie wondered sometimes if they would ever meet again when the summer was over, but had no doubt the time spent with the 3 from High Pass would shape the man he was becoming. Wiser and more cautious with his words for sure, with a deep respect towards girls, dragons, and mages instilled in him. Chapter 12. Wing, Ground, and Small Gifts. Rhaina was still grey when standing large, young dragon grey, the practical, unfinished colour that looks like morning smoke, waiting for a sun that has not yet earned the right to polish anything. Colour, Elisa had told her, comes when a dragon knows the whole of herself and can carry it without dropping pieces on the floor. Rhaina considered that intolerably slow, and therefore tried with childish efficiency to become herself faster by practicing everything at once. Riff practiced with her when they returned to the nest, which was made for standing large in ways a country estate was not. They trusted one another the way young creatures sometimes do before anyone tells them trust can be complicated. They learned to move together in flight and fire and friendship. Later, inside, within the quiet song of the nest, Raina shadowed Solara down the narrow passage beside the winter stores. Solara had 3 large jars in her arms and a look of arithmetic on her face about navigating the stairs with one hand short. "Give," Raina demanded, reaching. "No," Solara said, not unkind. "You did not say please." "Please?" "I am careful," Raina promised, and Solara handed her a jar to carry. "You were supposed to rest," Solara said. "You were supposed to eat," Raina countered. "You did not eat. I saw you leaving to meet the delivery boy before food was served." "I will bring a tray," she announced. "You will bring a tray and leave to rest, and not watch me chew," Solara amended. Raina made a sound that was neither assent nor refusal, carried the jar to its destination, and later brought a tray, bread, dried plum, a small dish of the sour pickled things Solara liked, and left it on the work table as if it had arrived anonymously. Then she walked to the doorway, half-turned, and looked back long enough to confirm a bite was taken before going back to her room to rest. She had since from the very start seen Solara as her second mother, and now treated her with a young dragon's proprietary protectiveness toward the one that had shown her softness. Where Elisa's care was bright, edged, a thing that could scold mountains and teach one to wield power, Solara's was the patient tending that saw spills cleaned, boots set properly to dry, bruises gently blown on, and tears wiped. Even a young dragon needed that softness at times. Solara accepted her care as only natural, for milk made a connection much like blood, and Riff did not mind having an almost sister and a full friend. Alaris watched the morning drills from the arch sometimes with a mug going cool in his hands. Raina saw him there and felt a pinch, odd, brief, as he turned away when Riff arrived, attention transferring like a coin. Riff would take sword or staff or stand with it at the ready waiting for instruction. Alaris would correct her stance by moving a foot, a finger's width, or nudging an elbow. Raina's throat would feel heat, wanting to declare itself irrelevant, and then, embarrassingly, something smaller, envy curdled with anger, would drift in unwelcome. She tried ignoring it, scolding it, and finally, in frustration, burning the source of it. Rife had soaked up the fire and asked without offence what was troubling her friend. When she told her, Rife had suggested that talking it through with her father might be best. Yet, she felt, since she was not stingy sharing her mother with Raina, she could perhaps share her father too with some grace. Raina stalked into the armoury while Alaris was rewrapping the grip on Riff's practice sword and sat down hard, cross-legged and grumpy. "You give Riff everything," Raina declared without softening, because subtlety had seemed an unreasonable expectation. Alaris looked up, blinked once and looked at her with surprise. "I train her," he said. "That is not everything." "You do not train me that way," Raina argued, then frowned because she knew he did train her, just differently. "You are not human," he said. "I have little to teach you. What I am teaching to Riff, your mother says, would only hinder you. I listen to her. I'll try to give you other things." Alaris extracted a small box from his pocket and handed it to her. Raina turned it over in her hands, then opened it with the grave care she reserved for things that might be oaths in disguise. Inside lay a selection of sweets in all colours and flavours. "This is a very small everything," she said, caught between laughter and the old pinch. "It is for you," Alaris answered, gentler than correction and without apology. "I do not have the sky to give you, or new ways to be a dragon. I have small tokens to give. A sweet for today because you forget to be kind to yourself." Raina looked down again, felt the shape of the envy loosen like a knot that had finally been shown its own end. "You bring me care," she said, the words thoughtful now. I bring you what I have and you lack, he said quietly. Sweets when you forget to be kind to yourself. Correction when you would rather have praise, but have not worked hard enough to earn it. Encouragement when you would rather quit. Raina put a sweet in her mouth, shut the lid, and held the box a heartbeat longer. Thank you, Father, she said with a mouth full of sweetness. The next morning, Rife found Raina already on the terrace, ready for practice and friendship to resume. When they rested at noon, she offered Rifa a sweet from her little box of everything and told her that it is indeed fair that she shares her father with Rif, for she has none of her own, while she has both mother and a father, and even a share of Solara's affection. Rif took a sweet and smiled, leaning her head on her friend's shoulder. The nest approved of all this. Small offerings properly tended, feelings put where they could not trip feet in the dark. Colour could wait. Trust had gone ahead to set the table.